Welcome to the December 2015 update from the Microsoft Australia OEM Server team. In this month's update, we'll be covering off the ways that you can go through and start leveraging Microsoft's Hyper-V server in production environments as well as internal usage and internal demonstration scenarios. So this is based on some of the feedback and questions we've received about some of the best ways that you can start investigating how to leverage Hyper-V server, and also how you can build out demonstration environments that you may have in your own production environments, or even for mobile environments that you take out to client locations, to give them ideas around some of the different technologies that they may be able to leverage in current versions of Windows Server. So if we take a look at today's agenda, first up we've got the Hyper-V overview. So this will be a quick run through of some of the capabilities of Hyper-V, and because this is something from the OEM server side, we will be focusing on some of the hardware elements here. Then we'll move on to talking about Hyper-V deployment options. So with Hyper-V, we've got quite a variety of ways that we can actually get this deployed, depending on the types of environments that we want to be running it in, whether it's something that needs to be fixed in a production environment or something that we actually want to travel around with. Now, moving on, we'll cover some of the ways that you can get access to internal usage rights for running some of these environments, both for your own production purposes, as well as how you can get a hold of additional evaluation copies of software so that you can run them up for extended trials in your organization, so that you can get an idea of what the products are capable of and try to figure out what customers you've got that these scenarios may make more sense for. Then finally, we'll wrap up with a quick summary of the resources that are available that will give you a lot more information on some of the things that we have covered in today's recording. So let's jump in first of all and take a look at Hyper-V. So first of all, with Hyper-V, it's a role that can be installed on top of Windows Server installations, and you can install it using the Server Manager tool or directly with PowerShell. Now, when you do set up Hyper-V, the setup process is quite easy, and then when it comes to configuring it, some of the things you need to take into account are things such as live migration, Hyper-V replica, and these are things that we've done previous video recordings of. So you'll find that there are links to some of these things in this month's OEM server newsletter. So take a look at that newsletter to get all of the links so you can take a look at some of the videos that we've recorded earlier on this. Now, when it comes to setting up some of the networking, what you need to be aware of is that we've got three different types of virtual switches that you can set up. So we've got private, internal, and external. So with a private switch, what this means is that it's only available within the virtual machines themselves. So if virtual machines are on the same private switch, it means that they can communicate with each other. Now, next up we've got internal switch. So if machines are on the same internal switch, they can communicate with each other, but they can also communicate with the host server, so the server running Hyper-V, for example. And then finally we've got external switches. So with external switches, these are ones that effectively give us access to the network that the Hyper-V server is connected to. So this means that if it's connected to the local network, if there's also internet access, for example, then it can potentially take advantage of what they provide. Now finally, as we take a look at some of the other options here, for storage it supports local storage, it supports remote storage, and then for scalability we've got support for up to 320 logical processors and 4 terabytes of memory per server. So if you're looking at something where you really want to start scaling things out, you can obviously do that, but even if you've got a machine with as little as 4 gig of memory, you can get started and start deploying at least 1 or 2 small VMs to get an understanding of how some of these pieces work. If we take a look at the diagram on the right, what you'll see here is that above the hardware layer, this is where the Hyper-V hypervisor gets installed. So then we have the Windows Server parent partition. So this is where we can run and manage the Hyper-V role. And then over in the second partition, this is a child partition. So this is effectively what we think of as the virtual machines. Now, from a licensing perspective, even though we won't be covering licensing in much detail in this recording because we covered some of that last month, remember that Windows Server Standard includes the rights for 2 Windows Server VMs per license, and Windows Server Data Center includes an unlimited number of virtual machines on that single server per license. But if you do need more information on that, refer back to last month's recording where we do cover it in a lot more detail. So when we create virtual machines, we can again do it through Hyper-V Manager, or we can do it through Windows PowerShell. And now we've got the option of creating Generation 1 and Generation 2 virtual machines, which I'll talk about more in the upcoming slides. Now, with the virtual machine settings, you'll see some of these as we go through some of today's demonstrations. You'll see that we can go through, we can add additional disks, additional network adapters, additional SCSI controllers, remote FX adapters, so that if we want to provide accelerated graphics to the virtual machines, these are some of the types of things we can do through there. Now, Windows Server has also got a new virtual hard drive format called VHDX, which is much more resilient, supports much better dynamic expansion capabilities, and it's really the path that Microsoft will try to push you down by default when you do start working with virtual machines inside of Hyper-V. It also supports VHDX resizes, so when a VM is running, we can go through, we can resize the VHDX files if needed, and it's also got support for 4K sector sizes, so it works better with today's hard drives that are out in the market versus the old 512 byte format that used to be more prevalent. Now, within each virtual machine, we can have up to 64 virtual processors and up to 1 terabyte of memory. So obviously for most SMB requirements, we can definitely meet those with this. Now, when we take a look at Gen 1 and Gen 2 virtual machines, the big difference here is that Gen 1 VMs are effectively based on older hardware platforms, so it's a BIOS-based system. Effectively, it's something like, the chipset underneath all of it is something along the lines of an Intel 440BX chipset. So this is quite a dated chipset in terms of the hardware support, etc., that it's got built in. And as we start taking a look at what a Generation 2 VM provides, this starts giving us better networking capabilities, so we don't need to use emulated network adapters for things such as PXE boot, so that if you are doing WDS deployments, this is obviously going to really speed up the deployment process. We can now do things like boot from a SCSI disk, we can boot from a SCSI virtual DVD, we've got secure boot, we've got UEFI support in there as well. But some of the things that have been removed are support for legacy connector types. So you'll find that there's no option to add in like some of the older ports, for example, that we may have had in there. So if you do have something that requires an emulated serial port, for example, that's not something that a Gen 2 VM is going to provide to you. Now, when we take a look at the network performance features, while most of these are probably things that are going to be more important in a production environment versus than a lab environment, these are important things to know when it is time to look at how you'd start deploying this in customer environments. So things like virtual receive side scaling, so making sure that any CPU load that's generated by the network traffic gets spread across multiple CPUs in the host operating system. We've got the dynamic virtual machine queue, so processor cores are dynamically allocated, so that again trying to eliminate that CPU zero bottleneck, so making sure that there's more of a balanced load being placed across the virtual CPUs in the system. And then we've also got single root IO virtualization, or SRIOV, and this allows the physical NIC capabilities to be accessed by the VMs. So this means that it can basically bypass some of the overhead involved in virtualization and start really giving you much better performance with the remapping of the interrupts, as well as giving you DMA capabilities. Now, some of the capabilities that were introduced with Windows Server 2012 and enhanced with Windows Server 2012 R2 include live migration. So with live migration, we've got the ability to go through and do a migration between one running Hyper-V server and another Hyper-V running server. And in this case, you can see that we've got, the shared backend storage could be iSCSI, it could be Fiber Channel, it could be SMB 3.0 storage, for example. And what we can do also now with Windows Server 2012 R2, and it's not the scenario we've got here, but it's another scenario that is available, is a shared nothing live migration. And with a shared nothing live migration, we don't need to actually have that third piece of the story here. So we don't need to have shared storage. We can actually do the storage migration as well during the migration process. So if you take a look at this, when we do a live migration, initially the virtual machine is being stored on that shared storage location, and we establish a connection over to the other Hyper-V host. Once that connection is established, the configuration information is pushed across, and then whatever is sitting in memory is transferred. So if it's a 1 gig VM, it's going to be a pretty quick transfer. If it's a VM with 32 gig or 64 gig of memory associated with it, then it's going to take a little bit longer for that to go across. But these are things where we'd be looking at having at least a gigabit connection between those servers to make sure these processes did run very effectively. So once we've got the memory copied across, then we'll go through and modified memory pages are also written across. And then we'll get to the point where that virtual machine is, or that second server is effectively current with the first server. So we can actually switch over and establish the connection into that shared storage and take over that that connection. So this is something that can be a very, very fast process, and there's very little time required to do this. Now, if we were doing this with a shared nothing migration so that we didn't have the shared storage, this means we'd also be pushing across the entire contents of the virtual machine as well. So if you think about this average size of a virtual machine, you might be talking 30 gig if it's just a small OS-based one. If it's something that's got a bunch of database files, it could be several terabytes. So you'd need to factor in how much time it takes for that to occur. So that migration process would be a lot slower. Now, we've also got storage live migrations. So this is something that we'd be using if we realized that for some reason, we needed to move it off one storage location and move it to another storage location. So in this case, it could be two remote targets. It could be a local disk and a remote disk. It doesn't really matter, but as long as we've got the appropriate permissions on both locations, we can go through and effectively in the background we can start copying the contents of the VHD from source 1 to the target device, and then once the two of them are in sync, it can go through and keep writing to both at the same time, and then it can switch over and start using that new target device. So again, there'll be no downtime for the users, and the idea with this is that we could be moving from slower disks to faster disks. We might be doing a replacement of our disk subsystem, so this makes it very easy for us to go through and do this without having an impact on the end user productivity. Now with Hyper-V Replica, this was introduced in Windows Server 2012 and was enhanced in Windows Server 2012 R2. But effectively it gives us the ability to go through and do server-to-server replication so that we can have a virtual machine being copied across to another Hyper-V host. So if we do have a network outage or service issues, we can switch across, start up that secondary VM, and keep things up and running inside of our organization. Now, what was added in Server 2012 R2 was what's called extended replication or chained replication. So in this case, the primary site connects through to the replica site, but then we've got the option of setting up another copy. So this could be another one on our internal network, or in a lot of cases, it might be something that people choose to push out to a cloud provider so that they've actually got this hosted recovery environment sitting out in a cloud environment so they can recover in case that there is like a disaster, a natural disaster, for example, in their own area. They can easily go through and start pulling things up and getting the network up and running again, but from a remote location. So let's now take a look at some of the capabilities we've got now inside of Windows 10 Hyper-V. And one of the new features that I'll highlight in here is nested virtualization. So I'll just switch across to Hyper-V Manager first of all and show you the virtual machine that we've got running. If we take a look at the settings for this virtual machine, you'll see that it's a Generation 2 VM. The way we can tell that is when we start taking a look at the firmware details, it shows us that it's using EFI. We can see that it's using Windows Boot Manager. We can see the firmware device path, etc. So this is giving us an indication that that it's not using the traditional old BIOS. What also highlights this is that you can see here that secure boot mode is enabled, and you'll notice that some of these options are grayed out, and the reason that they're grayed out is because this VM is currently running. Now for memory, if you take a look at some of the earlier recordings we've done on Hyper-V, you'll see here that we've got the ability to use our dynamic memory, which I've explained in more detail in the past. But in this case, I've given this virtual machine a fixed amount of memory. We can go through, we can set up how many different CPU cores we want it to access. I mentioned one of the benefits of Gen 2 virtual machines is that we can boot off SCSI disks. So here you can see I've got a SCSI hard drive as well as a SCSI DVD drive that's got the Windows 10 ISO mounted. Now I've got one network adapter included, but if I wanted to go through and start adding additional hardware, you can see here that I can easily add another network adapter, I can add another SCSI controller, I can add a remote FX 3D video adapter, so that if I want, as I mentioned, if I wanted to accelerate the performance of certain graphics options inside of the virtual machines, this is something that I can directly do from here as well. So I won't make any changes here because the virtual machine is already running. But if we jump back to Hyper-V and take a look at the Hyper-V settings, some of the things that I've got in here, things like the physical GPUs. So you can see here, this is just using the inbuilt GPU of the CPU and telling me that, that I have enabled it so that I can expose this GPU with Remote FX. Now, we mentioned storage migration, so I've got the ability to go through and set how many different storage migrations I'd like to set up at once. Now, this is something where generally you probably don't want to make too many adjustments to this one, but it's really going to be the disk subsystem that you're the disk subsystems that you're working with are really what determines how many you should configure in here. So other things we've got in here is the ability to set the default locations for where we want virtual hard disk files to be created, where we want the virtual machine configuration files to be created. So quite easy settings to create in here. Now for the virtual switch manager, as I mentioned, we've got the external, internal and private switches, and as you can see here in this environment, this machine does get connected to a variety of different network adapters. So we've got multiple physical adapters, so you can see from this I've got a Marvel one, I've got DisplayLink, I've got Realtek, I've got an ASICs. So I've got those, I've got internal networks, I've got private virtual switches set up as well. So it's easy enough for me to go through and create a new one if I needed to, and then I could make that available to the virtual machines as well. But I won't go through that process as I have covered that in previous recordings. So what I do really want to focus on in this case is with this virtual machine that I've got running here, with the latest updates to Windows 10 and what's also now been exposed in Windows Server 2016 Tech Preview 4 is the ability for you to have nested virtualization running. So what's nested virtualization? Well, that means that we can go through, and if I jump into the virtual machine and I type in Hyper-V Manager, now forgive the low screen resolution here, just trying to make everything fit. And what we can do in here is, you can see here that it's telling me that, okay, that is actually this VM. So how can I double check that? So if we go and take a look at the computer name, so desktop 585B3J1, desktop 585B3J1, I can now go through and create new virtual machines inside of virtual machines. So I could have one self-contained file that contains a continuing nest, or nested virtual machines. So that if I wanted to go out and really build out an entire environment that I could very easily move from one machine to another, or this is something where I could go through and I could just keep extending this further and further. And this is something where the more memory you've got and the faster the disk subsystem you've got here, you can make some fairly amazing scenarios. But in this case, it's a machine with, it's only got 8 gig of memory in total, and giving 4 gig to this VM doesn't really give a lot of space to do that. But this gives you an idea that you can build it out in one environment, copy it across to another, or you could create one copy and distribute it to multiple people, so they've all got that same demonstration environment to work with very, very little configuration actually required on each host machine that you're copying it to. So especially if you're setting these things up with private networks or internal networks, it means that they're not going to be able to access other machines on the network, so having duplicate copies of the same things running isn't going to be a problem. So yeah, the other things that we saw that we could do in the host, well, this is effectively a host running within a host now. So we can take a look at things like the Hyper-V settings. We can take a look here. So obviously we can't get direct access to the GPUs from here because it is virtualized. But this gives you an idea that there's an incredible ability to go through and start building out some great scenarios here. So these are things that if you've got someone who wants to focus on building this out and then sharing things with other people in your organization, it's a fantastic way to go through and do that. So what I'll do now is just switch back to the presentation. And we'll continue on with that. So let's jump in and talk about Hyper-V deployment options. So When it comes to Hyper-V Server, so this is really just the very thin, very light version of Hyper-V Server, where we can go through and we can install that in a production environment on Windows Server 2012 R2, or sorry, there's a 2012 R2 edition. There's also a 2016 Tech Preview 4 edition that's available as well now from the TechNet Evaluation Center, which I'll mention shortly. Now, with Windows Server 2016, there's also another option which I haven't listed here, which is for those who really want to go down the lightweight server path and then get Hyper-V running on top of that. There's also the Windows Server 2016 Nano Server technology that allows you to go through and install the Hyper-V role on that as well. But that's something that we'll save for another topic in the future. Now, as we move across to Windows Server, really the two main ones to think about today are Windows Server 2012 R2, or if you wanted to just set this up in a test environment or a lab environment, your Windows Server 2016 Tech Preview 4. Now, just to sort of give a word of advice here around, whether or not you should be using Tech Preview 4. I recommend it from a learning perspective, but not in terms of something where you're going to be running production workloads. So if it's something that you're tearing up and ripping down on a regular basis, Tech Preview 4 is fine. But if it's something that you need to keep running and that you need to contact support if something goes wrong, you really need to keep running on Windows Server 2012 R2, and then maybe just start up some Tech Preview 4 virtual machines underneath those to get an understanding of some of the new capabilities. Now we can also run this on Windows Client. So if you've got Windows 8.1 Pro or higher or Windows 10 Pro or higher, you can also run Hyper-V as you just saw. And in this case with Windows 10, I'd really push you down this path here instead, because in this case it's running on that's a production version of Windows 10 where I'm getting that nested virtualization capability. So what's important to note is that even though Windows clients don't support all of the functionality of Windows Server or Hyper-V Server, it's important to note though that some of the things that are missing around live migrations, the replication capabilities, they're probably things that in a test environment, if you need to sort of go around and show people some running scenarios, they're probably not really the main features that you need. But then if you do need those features, that's where with Windows 10 with nested virtualization, you can really start coming up with some very advanced scenarios underneath that, because you are effectively if you're running Hyper-V Server 2016 or Tech Preview of Windows Server 2016 underneath that, you can start setting some of those things up underneath the nested virtualization. So it really does give you the best of everything. Now for the deployment scenarios, where would you use Hyper-V Server? Well, Hyper-V Server doesn't include a GUI, so you'll need to be using PowerShell or get the machine joined to a domain so that you can do remote management from tools such as Remote Server Admin. So if you've also got more advanced hardware and you really want to leverage it and get Windows Server to make the most of it, then Hyper-V Server or Windows Server are going to be best for those. Now with Windows Server, you'd be using this if you're more familiar with the GUI and are sort of trying to, still trying to get up to speed with PowerShell and you don't want to be completely dependent on it in some cases, then Windows Server is going to do that for you. So then when would you use Windows Client? Well, if you need to run it on a laptop or a tablet, you need to take it around with you and show things to people. Okay, that's the best way to do it, because you'll get your full capabilities of Windows on that device. So, all of your devices will work because, Windows 10 will be loaded, but it also means that you can still leverage a lot of those Hyper-V capabilities and build out some fantastic scenarios, especially with Windows 10 and nested virtualization. So what are the deployment scenarios you should be thinking about? Well, Hyper-V Server, what's it best for? Well, if you do want to go through and you want to become more familiar with PowerShell, the final thing that I forgot to mention down here is with the preview editions, these are best for learning about the upcoming capabilities. So this is something where you can go through, you can run the tech previews of Windows Server, for example, if you wanted to get more familiar with those. But as I mentioned earlier, you can't really run those in a production environment and also get support on them from Microsoft Support, for example. So you do have to play carefully with that one. So now let's move on and talk about the different ways that you can access software for internal usage. And we'll start off with the Microsoft Action Pack subscription. So for those of you who may already be Gold or Silver Microsoft Partner Network members, you've already got access through those programs. But for those of you who aren't subscribers to any of Microsoft's partner programs, the one that I'd really recommend is taking a look at the subscription level, which gets you the Microsoft Action Pack. And this gives you access to downloadable ISOs, and I'll talk about some of the things that you've got as part of that in the next slide. But you get some Office 3, you get, I think off the top of my head, you get 5 Office 365 licenses, you get EMS licenses, you get $100 US per month of Azure credit, you get some pre-sales support included, as well as a host of other benefits. Now, the full details are available here just at just on the mspartner.microsoft.com site. But if you just do a search for Microsoft Action Pack subscription, you will get full details of that. So what are some of the bits of software that are included here? So you've got 10 Windows Pro licenses, you've got 2 Windows Server licenses, you've got 10 Windows Server CALs, you've got 10 RDS CALs in there, as well as a variety of other things such as a copy of Windows Server Essentials, Foundation, and Windows Storage Server Workgroup Edition. So you get a fair few server products included in there, along with along with SQL Server as well. So as I mentioned Exchange because one of the questions that comes up is, well, Exchange isn't in there. And no, that's correct. Exchange is not in there. And if you do want to use Exchange capabilities, that's where your Office 365 licenses will give you Exchange Online capabilities. So these are ones that you can use internally. You can use them for production. You can use them for demonstration. Really, you're not restricted in terms of how you use these as long as you are using them within the end user license agreement rights. Now, the other way that you can get a hold of evaluation copies of software is through the TechNet Evaluation Center. And as you can see here, you've got on the right, you can see here that I've filtered it so that we've got a few different servers, we've got some Windows 10 pieces in there, and we've got generally 90-day evaluations or 180-day evaluations for things that are going to be potentially more complex testing scenarios. But this gives you an idea that there's a variety of different ways, whereas the Action Pack is a paid annual subscription. The TechNet Evaluation Center, these are free trials that you can go and grab. And if you need to do the trial again afterwards, you can go through and go through that process again. So full details here, if you just do a search on TechNet Evaluation Center, it will take you to this page. You will need to sign in with a Microsoft account in order to access this, but I'm guessing that most of you probably already have a Microsoft account anyway. So just now to wrap up for today, there's really just 3 main resources that I want to make you aware of. The first one is SmartHQ, which is the site that obviously, if you're receiving this newsletter, you're probably already accessing SmartHQ to get things such as access to this video recording, etc. But it's microsoftsmarthq.com.au. We've also got the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site, which is primarily focused on Windows Server, some Windows 10, with a bit of a strong SMB focus, and that's at blogs.technic.com/Oz OEM team. And then there's also the pre-sales information for OEM server products at oemserverau@microsoft.com, and generally we get answers back to you fairly quickly on that one. So that's it for this month's recording. So take a look at this month's newsletter. You'll find that there's some additional recordings that you can find that we've done on Hyper-V Server so that you can get an idea of some of the additional capabilities, as well as they include demonstrations of things like live migrations as well as Hyper-V replica scenarios on Windows Server. So take a look at those, but for now I'd like to say thank you for joining us this month, and I look forward to you joining us next month.